Anybody else feel like August is the Sunday of summer? It is the perfect time to hit reset before the autumn rush. And for me, I start with my wardrobe. Quince proves that you do not need a big crowded closet to look incredible. You just need a few of the right pieces. They specialize in effortless, high quality essentials. Quince has ultra soft organic cotton, premium Mongolian cashmere sweaters, beautifully tailored, built to last, fit properly, and they transition seamlessly from morning meetings to dinner after work. Quince has premium stretch denim that starts at just $50 with the kind of perfect fit and structure and weight that you might look for a long time and only expect to find from a luxury brand. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar quality brands. They work directly with ethical factories, cut out the middlemen, so what you pay for is quality rather than brand markup. And it isn't just apparel. Quince also brings the same kind of elevation to hotel quality bedding, bath and kitchen staples, essentials, and thoughtfully designed furniture. I am a big sucker for handbags of all kinds. Lately, I have been carrying the Italian quilted stitched sling bag everywhere. I bought it in two different colors, cream for summer, and I will be wearing it in the brown color for fall. That is one of my favorites, and it makes me a fan of Quince every time I get a compliment. Upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/KERA. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK as well. That is QUINCE.com/KERA. If you're ordering up an aircraft carrier, it might be a decade or more from the time the thing is commissioned to the day it's launched, with a price tag well north of $10 billion. But if you intend to fight using drones, some might cost as little as around $1,000 and might be ready within a matter of weeks. And the designs of those cheap drones are easy to update and adapt as conditions change. The pace of change in how wars are fought is unprecedented in human history, and it seems to still be accelerating. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Military leaders in our era not only have to make the right decisions for which technologies to invest in and which to sunset, they also need to figure out how to best use things like drones and AI-guided missiles to their greatest advantage, how to anticipate and deter their enemies' use of these technologies, and how to get the troops they command trained to use all this new stuff. It would be hard to overstate those challenges, so we've invited Yaroslav Trofimov to help us understand them. He is chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where you can find his article, There's a New Way of War, but is it evolution or revolution? Yaroslav, welcome to Think.
Great to be on the show. Thank you.
How do we know that these leaps forward in technology really are happening much faster than they have in the past?
Well, I think what we see is that leaps in technology overall in the last 10, 20 years have transformed our lives in ways that technology probably hadn't transformed lives for generations. If you just look at how the use of phones, iPhones, smartphones, social media, electric vehicles, how the world is increasingly more connected. Uh, so the pace is accelerating, obviously with the arrival of AI. And this changes have been really slow to penetrate the way the militaries operate, because a lot of the fighting, the sort of the way the militaries are fighting, had been stuck in the ways of the past century. Artillery use, tanks. Uh, so the infantry doctrine hadn't really been updated for decades in serious ways. And so now, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but also now with the wars in the Middle East, we've seen that this consumer technologies developed for civilian life, have increasingly been repurposed and reinvented to make warfare different and to make warfare cheaper, and also to equalize the playing field between nations like the United States, or for that matter, Russia, that had been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on the newest defense innovation and on the military budgets overall, and much smaller countries that are finding ways to offset the disadvantage through technology, be it Ukraine, be it Iran, or be it others.
It's a double edged sword, isn't it? Because we have lowered the financial cost of self defense. We've also lowered the cost of aggression or unprovoked attacks.
Well, this is the way technology develops overall. So it's not something that we can say that we have lowered. We have lowered. This is just what happened. But I think it's true. It's true that it's increasingly difficult to defend against technologies like drones or like ballistic missiles. And we've seen that countries like Iran have developed the ability to produce precision ballistic missiles that can hit targets more than 1,000 miles away. Countries like Ukraine are also working on this program. And I think we could expect that many more other countries will have long-range drones, long-range missiles that can target what used to be thought of as very, very safe areas. And the cost of shooting down those missiles and drones is higher than the cost of making them. And so the mathematics of this war really, favor the countries that are trying to attack others. On the other hand, also the new arithmetics of war make it much harder to launch old school ground offensives. If you think about, the U.S. war against Iraq, be it in 1991 or be in 2003, this sort of massive ground campaign with tank columns, Marine and infantry vehicles and army vehicles moving up through the plains, be it to liberate Kuwait city in 1991, be it to capture Baghdad in 2003, are very hard to imagine now because the advent of new technologies means that this massings of troops and personnel will be spotted very quickly and targeted very quickly, far away from reaching the actual battlefield, which is something that we are seeing now in the battlefields of Ukraine, where Russia operates with groups of 2 to 3 people trying to sneak in behind Ukrainian lines, and where mass offensives of tanks are almost unheard of in recent years.
What's happened to the notion of air superiority? The idea that one country would have such effective, planes and bombers that it could do a lot of attacks that its enemies can't possibly match.
Well, I think again, I think the very notion of air superiority has changed, because let's think of how air forces used to operate. You had to have a pilot in a plane, and they would fly above a country and drop bombs on it. And that's how it used to be, until the middle, even the end of the 20th century. And to do that, you had to suppress air defenses and suppress your enemy's air force. And then you have air superiority, or even the air supremacy, if you have full operational freedom to operate. But now, with the arrival of drones and precision weapons like ballistic missiles, things have changed. So look at the war against Iran. The Israeli and the American air forces had pretty much a free hand to operate in the skies over Tehran, and had air superiority across most of the country, in part because Iran didn't have much of an air force, in part because of the successes in suppressing Iranian air defenses. But at the same time, this didn't mean that American troops in the Gulf, or for that matter, major installations and infrastructure targets in the Persian Gulf and all the way to Jordan, were safe from Iranian air attacks, because despite not having an air force, a manned air force, Iran did have a very strong unmanned air force. That is, all these drones that could fly thousands of miles and strike targets and strike American bases, as did Iranian missiles. And so you can have this duality of air superiority in the manned aircraft domain, and yet you do not control the skies over your own troops because of the drones and missiles.
Depending on what any military is contracting to buy, right? Drones or planes or ships or tanks. In the past, it might have taken months or years for these things to be developed. What is different when militaries are fighting primarily or to a significant extent via drone?
Well, I think everything is a drone now. I think we have to think of a drone not as a weapon as such, but as a domain, and it's a domain of warfare that has been enabled by the two revolutions. The revolution in communications, that is the advent of systems like Starlink, that allow you to maintain a data feed and real-time contact with your unmanned systems throughout the world. And on the other hand, the advent of artificial intelligence that serves as a backup for when you lose control, and then the automatic intelligence can take over and either continue to seek targets as pre-programmed before, navigate using optical navigation, preloaded maps of terrain. They can just, even if this GPS signal is jammed, could still see the rivers and the highways and the cityscapes and figure out where it is and go where it's supposed to go, or to return to an area where it can reestablish connection with an operator. And so in this environment, you have to look at the arithmetics of the cost of war. So it's very important to have cheaper systems and a lot of systems. And that's, in fact, what we are seeing now in the war in Ukraine and Russia. Russia and Ukraine now each make millions of drones every year. And they cost in the tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they are, very different from these exquisite, very expensive systems that the US had developed in prior decades during the war on terror, be it in Afghanistan or Iraq, where you could fly the Predator drone to strike terrorists, and you didn't have to worry about the enemy's air defenses shooting it down. Well, now it's very different, and in the wars where air is contested, and that's going to be pretty much every war, because air defenses are also getting cheaper, including air defenses through drones, because now you have drones shooting down drones. It's important to have a lot of them, and it's important to have them at a low price. But it's also very important to be able to innovate very quickly, because if you look at how the battlefield has changed in the war between Russia and Ukraine, the systems that were in use in 2022 became obsolete in 2023, and then the new systems came to replace them, either to deal with the jamming or with the navigation issues, or with the sort of cat and mouse game between offense and defense. And so systems that are being made now will probably be obsolete in 6 months as well. And so I think the lesson here for the military companies is that they have to think of themselves not as a providers of a product, of a thing, of a physical object, but as a providers of a service in which they have to innovate together with the military and innovate responding to the innovation of the adversary.
Did the Ukrainians already have like a really robust drone development program before the last 4.5 years of war with Russia? I mean, they now have this global reputation of being very good at cranking out these drones very quickly.
No, I mean, there wasn't much of a drone industry. There was some drone industry in Ukraine before the war, but it wasn't very developed. Ukraine did, on the other hand, have a big military industry, including missile industry, and it had an aircraft industry. It was making the Antonov cargo planes, and so Antonov is now one of the major drone manufacturers in Ukraine. And I think it was an evolution going from cheap Chinese-made systems, repurposing them, reinventing them. But I think the important thing is not the actual drone here. I think people are sort of looking at the Ukrainian successes, or for that matter, Russian successes in the war with Ukraine. It's wrong to focus on the drone. The drone is just something at the very end of a chain, and Ukraine is able to achieve this kind of successes with the drones because they are integrated in a system in which feeds from tens of thousands of drones right now in the air are being all pulled together in like sort of Uber-like network that makes them available to various parts of the military because of the amazing, AI-enabled targeting sort of development that is behind the launch. Because when you fire this drone at a Russian refinery, 1,000 miles away, you have to plot its navigation course around Russian air defense areas, around areas where it could be shot down. And that's find the time and the space and the particular time of the day where it's the best likelihood of it reaching its target. So it's a lot of work that goes behind that. And in fact, Ukraine is now probably the only major country that has created, in addition to its army, its navy, and its air force, its own unmanned systems force, which is a separate branch of the military. And if you look at the results in the battlefield, something like 90%, maybe more, of Russian casualties in Ukraine or destroyed Russian equipment in Ukraine is a result of drones. For example, old school tube artillery has become almost obsolete now because if you look at the traditional howitzers, especially towed ones, that fire an artillery shell at maybe 10 miles, 15 miles, well, that's well within the range of most drones. So if this howitzer fires once or twice, it will be destroyed by an enemy drone that will spot it exactly and just fly it there. And if you also look at the cost, an artillery shell now in the markets, 155 millimeter artillery shell, which is the most commonly used caliber, is about $7,000. The cost of a drone that is precise, that unlike a shell will arrive directly on target and can fly much, much longer distance. We're talking about more than 100 miles versus 10 miles, is about $17,000. And you need many common artillery shells to hit one target, whereas one drone will be enough. And so, in a way, warfare has become cheaper by becoming more precise.
I'm thinking, Yaroslav, as new technologies, even just updated versions of older technologies, continue to come online all the time, you have two challenges, right? You have the challenge of getting the people expected to actually operate this equipment up to speed on how it works. And then you have the even greater challenge of making sure that leaders understand what the new technologies can do and how to best deploy them. Talk us through both of those sets of problems for any military.
Yeah, so I think it takes a special skill to be a drone operator, and it's different from a skill of an infantryman. A lot of the people doing it in Ukraine now are kids who are really good at video games. And it's a skill of a pilot, but different from a skill of a conventional pilot because some of the things that a pilot of a fighter jet has to train for and endure, like gravity forces, is not something that a drone pilot needs to be worrying about. So, you have to teach people, and you have to create this new class of troops that have a very different skill set from the ones that are currently in the military. And the same goes for the officers and the commanders, because all these people who had gone through military academies and staff colleges have learned the doctrine of the pre-drone age, and this doctrine doesn't apply anymore. And that's what the Russian commanders found, through defeat in Ukraine, and that's actually what we're seeing now in the Middle East, where American bases in many of the countries in the Gulf were not prepared for an attack from the sky by the Iranian drones or missiles. In the West, they still had all these fortifications that were thought up in the age when the threat was coming from Iraqi insurgents driving improvised explosive devices.
Does the term front line mean something different than it did years ago?
Well, absolutely, because there is no front line now. If you look at if you look back at the one infantry war that is being fought right now, the one between Russia and Ukraine, there is this giant gray zone now, maybe 20, 30 miles wide, in which no one is in charge, in which any movement by more than 2 or 3 people is usually discovered right away. And any vehicle trying to move across is picked out by dozens of drones. And the notion of who controls what village or what town is very blurry. There's been several months now of battling for the city of Kostyantynivka in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. Russia claims to control it. Ukraine claims to control it. But the reality is that you have groups of 2 or 3 soldiers, Ukrainian or Russians, sitting in the building here and there, several hundred yards from each other, and no one really controls it because nobody can safely drive a vehicle through the streets of the city as long as there are enemy drone operators sitting within several dozen miles, and that's the reality of combat now, and in which you can only move your forces through an area if you achieve air superiority in the drone domain, not in the conventional war domain, because that doesn't really help you.
Is this technology changing how many soldiers are needed by any country's forces to fight a war?
Up to a point. Up to a point. So you still need soldiers to take over and control a place. But I think it favors defenders because you can hold an area with a much smaller force if you have enough drone operators, if you have enough of a network to support and sustain them, if you have connectivity, and if you have a technological edge more than anything. And again, this revolutions, maybe not revolutions, but sort of the innovations can come very rapidly. If you look at the history of the Russian war against Ukraine, in 2023, Ukrainian forces, in 2024, Ukrainian forces seized a foothold in the Russian region of Kursk, which they held successfully for several months. And then the Russians came up with this innovation of using drones that are flying with an optical wire. So it's a wire that can be strung out for 10, 20, maybe even 30 miles, and that it's impervious to jamming. So all of a sudden, the jammers didn't work, and all these drones were hitting Ukrainian troops. And that's one of the reasons why Russia was able to reclaim that particular part of the front line. And so, and this cat and mouse game of innovation can change the balance of power on the front line, even without the change in the number of troops on each side.
You explained in this article that even the way Ukrainians are procuring weapons and supplies has changed in the last couple of years. Talk us through how this works.
Yeah, again, so Ukraine has the system under which individual brigades have a budget to buy weapons, and it's very different from the traditional procurement system, at the Pentagon or in other major Western defense ministries, where it's pretty much centralized, and contracts are awarded years and years before delivery. So there, because most of the deaths in this war, enemy deaths and hits on enemy equipment or enemy bases are recorded because they're carried out through drones. Brigades get points based on the number of kills. Classified network that is sort of very Uber-like, in which manufacturers also participate, and then they can place orders. And they can place orders for drones, they can place order for jamming equipment, and then manufacturers are paid real money for that. And manufacturers can come directly and work with individual brigades, embedding engineers with them, and finding solutions almost in real time. So you can have your weapon systems rethought, re-engineered in a matter of weeks, and then shipped to the front line.
I want to make sure I understand this. You said that, these different brigades can get points for the number of kills they have or the number of successful operations, and then they can acquire more stuff. Are you saying, are they essentially competing for resources, like the best units are going to get the most stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's how it works. They're competing for resources, and obviously, it's tweaked, because you have to take into account the operational environment and other requirements. But basically, yes, that's how it works. The more the better you are at performing, the more goodies you can get.
What does that do for overall military cohesion?
Well, that's a very good question, and I guess it's better than the alternative. It seems to work so far. The front line hasn't collapsed, and it has driven the innovation. So I think what also happens is once this brigades that are successful and are working with the manufacturers to refine a weapon, then that weapon can also be supplied to other brigades. And it's obviously not the only channel of weapon supplies. This is on top of what has always been there, sort of the central procurement by the defense ministry.
You mentioned these young soldiers who might have been really good at video games, and now they're sitting in a complex somewhere, partially operating these drones that are carrying out operations. I'm curious about how much, when things are being handled by autonomous systems, what that means, like where that autonomy starts and ends, where a computer mind is making the call on something as opposed to a human being.
Yeah, and that's, the Ukrainians and most Western militaries, as of right now, have a policy that there must always be a human in loop, which means that the final decision to engage a target is made by a person. So there is a judgment there. But what it means in reality is that, for example, you now have drones patrolling the roads in occupied parts of Ukraine, all the way down to Crimea, hunting for military vehicles, hunting for fuel tankers. And they are AI enabled, so they have optic recognition cameras. First of all, to find the way, to find the road, but then also to recognize the types of vehicles that are looking for by the patterns, by the heat signature, by the speed of movement. And then when they identify this fuel tanker, for example, there is a human that has to push a button and say, okay, engage. And at that moment, the drone pursues that vehicle autonomously, which means that you don't really have to have a pilot piloting into it, but the drone itself finds the best way, the best approach. And if that vehicle disappears into a tunnel, the drone can wait for it on the other side of the tunnel and hit it there. And from then on, it's an autonomous pursuit that is, not that dissimilar from, when you fire a missile and then missile then, is out of control and then finds its target. Now, what we have seen now with the Russian military in Ukraine is because they don't have Starlink access, so they do not have the ability to communicate with a drone as their drones are performing very similar missions inside Ukraine, then it's become fully autonomous. So, when the drone sees a truck, it just attacks a truck. And I think that's a very dangerous development, because now we actually are seeing the advent of fully autonomous weapons, that these drones that make their own decisions on what to hit, based obviously on the AI models in them, and very often they do make mistakes.
Even when there's a human in the loop, there's lots of evidence that humans sometimes trust the machine, if they're doing mathematics and they've come up with the correct answer, but the calculator tells them something different because it was programmed that way for the experiment. People doubt themselves. I mean, I'm curious about that relationship. If the technology tells the human in the loop that this is a good target or a bad target, are they sort of more likely to trust the machine than their own sense of things?
I think very often that's the case. It's not necessarily in the drone domain, but a lot of the targeting, for example, in the U.S. air campaign in Iran was done using AI. And as we know, there have been mistakes made, and some of the areas that used to be military before were no longer military by the time they were struck. And on the other hand, the sheer number of targets, this is sort of finding tens of thousands of places to strike would have been impossible if the humans alone were going through all these databases without the use of AI. So it has dangers. It carries dangers. I think if you look at drones, it's a little bit less of it, because a human in the loop would see a drone identifying a military truck, would also probably see a civilian vehicle right next to it, and not authorize a hit at that very moment. So that's sort of the safeguard, because I think ultimately it's the human that makes the judgment on what is the acceptable level of collateral damage. What are the other circumstances out there? Something the machine that is programmed to look for specific things may not necessarily take into into consideration as part of this context.
Yaroslav, what does any of this mean in terms of the relative risks to non-combatants? In a world where you have autonomous weapons working alongside people actually making decisions, is that world more dangerous or less dangerous for civilians than a war just carried out the old-fashioned way?
I think it's more dangerous for civilians, first of all, because of the range. These weapons can now reach into areas that are far, far away from the front line. They can probably in a few years we can be able to reach anywhere in the world, and it makes infrastructure targets much more dangerous, because we now live in the world in which we rely on having 24-hour electricity. We rely on having fuel available for our cars. We rely on having internet connections, data centers. And what we have seen, for example, with the Iranian drone attacks in the Persian Gulf, is just how easy it is to destroy all of that and create conditions that are not very conducive to modern life. And it comes at a time when we are building systems for efficiency. And so your refinery 100 years ago had multiple refining units, that were scattered in large space. Now, there's one or two, and it only takes one drone to knock out the whole system. And the same goes for data centers, and the same goes for power stations in many places. And so I think a lot of the infrastructure in the US, in Europe, and other countries in the West is actually at much more of a risk than we thinking about now, precisely because even second and third tier adversaries of the US and Western countries will soon have or already have access to these technologies.
We worry about military personnel who suffer from moral injury for their role in attacks that might conflict with their personal values. Are people still vulnerable to this if they are operating some kind of technology from a remote location that might be hundreds of miles away from where the target actually exists?
I think the same rules apply because let's not forget that you may be sitting, 200 miles from the front line. Doesn't mean that a missile will not fly into your office as you sit there and kill you. So the risk is also spread. In a war like the one between Russia and Ukraine, both sides are hunting for the drone operators and drone command centers, and sometimes killing them. And so I think that part of the equation really doesn't change because the risk is everywhere really. Um, the kind of clinical efficiency of this death and the fact that every death is now documented is probably something new because if you look at the war with Russia and Ukraine, but also the conflict in Lebanon with Hezbollah against the Israeli army, all these drone hits are recorded, they are released on social media. And I would say that probably the vast majority of Russian soldiers who were killed in Ukraine, there is a video somewhere showing their death. And I think this abundance of footage desensitizes a lot of civilians because people on both sides are also watching them every day. And kind of turns this whole killing into a video game business, which I think is a dangerous development.
Sure, because we just this is just a thing that we get used to happening because humans are really adaptable even to pretty horrendous things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So, Yaroslav, let's take up that question. You note there are differing opinions as to whether these recent changes really represent a revolution in war versus an evolution. First of all, how should we understand the difference between those two terms in this context?
Well, I think the question is, do we have to forget everything we've learned until now and start from a blank slate? Or will these new technologies coexist with the existing military equipment, existing sort of legacy knowledge and the legacy hardware? And I think the answer is yes. Even if you look back into history, yes, the invention of artillery and gunpowder and guns did revolutionize warfare, but somehow it also coexisted with cavalry and pikemen and people with with lances and swords for quite a long time, for centuries. And so the question is, how do we adapt the existing weapon systems, be it aircraft carriers, be it fighter jets, be it tanks, into this new drone age? And will they remain manned or unmanned? And to what extent do we have to change the doctrine? And I think there is a big and very robust debate about this among defense chiefs and defense officials around the world. And I think the opinion you hear most often is that it is an evolution, but an evolution with very, very rapid iterations, which means that the key to survivability in a conflict is not necessarily how good is your equipment and how good are your weapons, but how quickly can you adapt them, replace them, and tweak them once your opponent embraces a newer technology that offsets your advantage. And I think this flexibility is really the strength, sort of the measure of the strength of a country in the military conflict now. So how flexible is its military industrial basis? How flexible is its military? How flexible are its politicians to the environment that is changing so rapidly?
How much does that flexibility vary by the country you're talking about, the military you're talking about?
I think it varies greatly, and I think this is one area in which democracies have an advantage, because in a country like Russia or a country like China, it's discouraged to report bad news to your superiors, and the picture gets rosier the higher it gets up the chain of command, because that's just how autocracies work. And so, if you do not acknowledge the existence of a problem, it takes you a much longer time to fix it. I think the reason why a country like Ukraine was able to withstand 4.5 years of war against a much, much bigger opponent is precisely because its democratic nature allowed for the correction of the course and for adopting this innovation. And again, obviously, a country like the US that is huge and has the world's largest defense budget and has had the luxury of being by far the strongest military power in the world for such a long time, I think it will take an effort to realize that change is necessary and that some of the old ways must be changed. And I think the lessons of the war in Iran are part of that, because we were hearing for a very long time that the U.S. didn't have much to learn from the war in Ukraine because it will have this overwhelming air supremacy against any enemy. It will have all these precision weapons that will destroy and obliterate the enemy. And guess what? A large part of these precision weapons were expended over Iran, and the U.S. does have conventional air superiority over Iran, and yet it so far has not achieved the political objectives of this conflict and has exposed itself to this new kind of warfare that also, among other things, makes it very, very difficult to contemplate any sort of ground operation in Iran, because we know what enactment will be in this new age of drone warfare.
President Trump seems to have been taken by surprise that the strongest military in the world, the U.S., in partnership with Israel, has not just instantly achieved its goals in Iran, as you mentioned. As someone who studies this as part of your career, is it less surprising to you that the U.S. is struggling in Iran?
I mean, no, it is less surprising to me because, again, the kind of ground campaign that the U.S. carried out against Iraq twice, in 2003 and 1991, is just impossible now in Iran because of the size of the country, but also because any concentration of forces necessary for such a campaign would be very hard to sustain in the age of precise missile strikes and precise drone attacks. And that is the reason why the U.S. has had difficulties, because you cannot force Iran to accept U.S. conditions. At least it hasn't happened so far, absent a real threat of a ground operation. Attacks from the air only achieve so much. You can't really take over countries from the air.
How are military and defense leaders around the world deciding in this climate of rapid change where to invest their money in weapons and vehicle acquisition? Like, what new items are they taking on board? What things might they think about no longer making or sourcing?
Well, again, it's a lot of this decision making is political, and sometimes, unfortunately, because most of these countries live in peacetime. These are decisions made by considerations such as jobs. Should we build these very expensive ships that will create, tens of thousands of jobs in our wharves? Yes, let's do it. And that's not necessarily something that is the best way of spending money for defense. I think the technologies that are clearly becoming more obsolete are artillery shells. It is not the sort of extended range, but the traditional basic tube artillery shells. And it's funny because there was a big shortage of them 3 or 4 years ago, and defense manufacturers in Europe are now very proud that they finally wrapped up production. But they ramped up production by the time that the shells are becoming obsolete. And so, the tank manufacturing is probably another area that is increasingly becoming obsolete, because a tank is not really serving its purpose in modern infantry combat, and it's a very, very expensive toy that can be destroyed by a very, very cheap drone, as we have seen both with Russian tanks and Ukrainian tanks, and for that matter recently with Israeli tanks. And so where exactly to put your defense dollars, it's hard to find a recipe, because, again, you don't want to make 1 million drones if you're a European country now and then have them sit in a warehouse. and be obsolete by the time you're engaged in a conflict a few years down the line. And so I think the best way of sort of preserving your edge is, again, I'm going back to this issue of flexibility. You have to have a defense industry that is able to change course rapidly. And I think, if you look at the defense industries in the US and most Western countries, these are defense industries of a relative peacetime and defense industries of a time where no wars were fought against comparable adversaries. And they are not used to that. And they are also used to making very, very expensive weapons in small numbers. And they do not survive the modern battlefield.
If defense contractors happen to overproduce something that becomes quickly obsolete or is obsolete as soon as the order is filled, should we worry those weapons, which, I mean, they may be obsolete, but they still work, that they might be sold at fire sale prices to non-state actors like terrorist groups or criminal cartels?
Well, I think in most Western countries and non-Western countries, they have very robust end-user procedures that preclude such a sale. And obviously, in the U.S., weapons manufacturers will not be selling weapons to terrorists. So I don't think so. And terrorists not only using tanks or aircraft carriers. Again, these weapons are obsolete in a conflict against a modern opponent. They probably will not be obsolete if you have to do an anti-terrorist campaign or a peacekeeping mission against a guerrilla organization or a weak military in a small country.
It has been impressive to watch Ukraine, as an example, hold out for all this time. But you note that the lessons from that war, against a much larger opponent in Russia, might not be as simple as having countries convert all their equipment to exactly what's working for Ukraine. Why not?
Well, Ukraine obviously is a country at war, an existential war, and you cannot expect a country that is not at war to make similar sacrifices to the way they do things. On everything, including labor safety laws. Obviously, it's much easier for a Ukrainian company to make drones and wartime regulations because they don't have to worry about lots of things such as environmental regulations that a company in Germany or in the US has to worry about. Now, I think the overarching lesson, though, of the war in Ukraine is that you have to be able to adapt. You have to be very quick, and the speed of your adaptability matters more than the quality of your actual weapons today, because you have to be able to respond, like in a boxer match, to the blows coming from your opponent by changing your game and by finding solutions.
What have you learned, Yaroslav, about how designers of weapons and other military systems are coming up with these new adaptations? What is their process?
I think the process really lies in talking to your consumers. So you have to be able to test your weapon in real conditions, and the results in real conditions are very often different from the results in a lab, or in a peaceful country, or against a made-up opponent. And then you have to have this feedback loop. And I think that's the value of the collaboration that many defense companies now have with Ukraine, is because they can see what works, what doesn't work against a powerful and real opponent, and they can find ways of tweaking their systems to make them work.
Does anything in the way that wars and their execution is changing suggest the possibility that we might have fewer wars in the future, that people might sort of look at the risks and the calculations and decide to try doubly hard to use diplomacy to solve their conflicts? Or in fact, are we looking at probably a future of more hot conflicts?
I mean, I'd like to be an optimist, but it's very hard to argue the case for optimism here, because the entry barrier to war, I think, is much lower now. More and more countries, and maybe not even countries, will have access to these technologies in the future. And also, the line between war and peace is becoming increasingly blurry, because you can have this drone attacks on critical infrastructure and deny your responsibility, and and we have seen this hybrid warfare already developing in Europe. We're seeing warehouses going up in flames in countries like Britain or Poland. And this was the handiwork of Russian intelligence services, but it's still an act short of war. And so I think the more and more this drone technology and other precision weapons technology becomes accessible to smaller and poorer players, the more risks they are, because we used to think that we are safe in the West, in the US or in Europe, but potentially there are dozens of rogue regimes that will have the capability to strike critical infrastructure in these countries and down the line in a matter of just a few years, maybe 2 or 3.
What is your process as chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal of keeping up with pertinent changes in military technology?
Well, just talking to a lot of people. Obviously, I read a lot of literature and reports, but also, speak to defense chiefs, defense ministers, top officials in intelligence services and in defense companies very, very regularly. And I think this particular article was a result of talking to many of these people.
Are commanders worried about their capacity to keep up with what's changing all the time?
I think they are. I think increasingly so. And again, as I said, the war in Iran was very sobering for many people who thought that they don't really have to worry about this change and that they have everything under control.
Yaroslav Trofimov is chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where you can find his article, which is titled, "There's a New Way of War, but Is It Evolution or Revolution?" Yaroslav, this has been very, very interesting. Thanks very much for making time for the conversation.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and listen to our podcast for free wherever you like to get your podcast. Just search for KERA Think. Our website is think.kera.org, and that's where you can find out about upcoming shows as well as sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.